"Someone died in there," said the girl, touching the abandoned van. "But when they open it, they discover something terrible." Let me know what you thought of this story by giving it a score from 0 to 10 in the comments, and tell me what city you're watching from. I'd love to know if you enjoyed my story and get to know you better, so please subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The scrape of sandals on the ground echoed through Prescott Square as Arthur Blackwood walked hurriedly toward the central bank of Oak Haven. The 52-year-old businessman carried a black briefcase full of documents about the expansion of Blackwood Springs, his thermal water company that he had built over 20 years of hard work. The March sun beat down on the historic square's cobblestones, creating shadows that danced among the golden trumpet trees, characteristic of the region. It was an ordinary Thursday when his life changed forever. A high-pitched voice cut through the morning air, making Arthur stop abruptly. A 4-year-old girl, wearing a faded pink t-shirt and ripped denim shorts, ran toward him with her arms outstretched. Her brown hair was disheveled, and her bare feet showed the calluses and small wounds typical of someone who lived on the streets. Mister, the child cried, grabbing the hem of Arthur's dress shirt. "There's someone hurt in the white van. I saw blood. Lots of blood." Arthur looked at the girl in surprise, then in the direction she was pointing. A white Volkswagen van was parked in the farthest corner of the square, near the old St. Jude's Chapel. The vehicle had been there for at least a week, covered in a thin layer of the red dust typical of Oak Haven soil. "What's your name, little one?" Arthur asked, crouching to be at the child's level. "Willow," she replied, wiping her nose on the back of her hand. "Mister, you have to help. Who's in there? I heard screams last night." Arthur's heart sped up. Other people began to approach, curious about the girl's commotion. Mrs. Gable, a 60-year-old woman who sold sweet rolls in the square every morning, was the first to arrive. "This girl is always making up stories to get food," she whispered to Arthur. "She showed up here 2 months ago. Nobody knows where she came from." But something, in the desperation in Willow's eyes, made Arthur ignore the comment. He stood up and walked toward the van, followed by a small group of onlookers that had formed. The businessman tried to open the driver's door, but it was locked. He went around the vehicle and found the side door partially ajar. "Someone call the police," Arthur requested, hesitating for a moment before fully opening the van's side door. The interior was empty, except for a few scattered objects. Old dolls with irregularly cut hair, crumpled and torn adult women's clothes, and some children's drawings made with broken-colored pencils. On the driver's seat, there were red lipstick marks on the rearview mirror, as if someone had used it to apply makeup hastily. "There's no one here," Arthur murmured, confused. Willow approached the van, her large eyes examining every detail of the interior. Suddenly, she pointed to one of the dolls. "This one is Poppy's," she said with certainty. "She always cut the doll's hair like this, real short." "Who's Poppy?" Arthur asked. "My sister," Willow replied simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Mrs. Gable shook her head. "This girl doesn't have a sister, mister. She lives alone around here, begging for food and making up all sorts of stories." But Arthur watched Willow's expression closely as she held the doll. There was no pretense there, only a deep, genuine sadness that made his chest tighten. The way she caressed the broken toy, as if it were something precious, revealed a true connection. "Where is your sister now, Willow?" he asked, ignoring the looks of disbelief from the other adults present. "I don't know," the girl whispered, clutching the doll to her chest. "She disappeared one day, but she left her things here. Maybe she'll come back." Arthur felt a knot in his stomach. There was something deeply wrong with this whole situation, something that went far beyond a child making up stories to get attention or food. The pain in Willow's eyes was too real, too old for someone of only 4 years. "And where do you sleep at night, Willow?" he asked, placing a hand on the girl's small shoulder. Sometimes on the park bench, sometimes in the pharmacy doorway when it rains, she answered naturally, as if it were normal for a 4-year-old to live like that. But I like the bench better because I can see Poppy's van. The crowd began to disperse when it became clear that nothing dramatic was happening in the van. Mrs. Gable shook her head one more time before returning to her post. Arthur, however, remained there, watching Willow examine each object inside the vehicle with the meticulousness of a detective. "Mister," she said suddenly, looking directly into his eyes, "can you help me find my sister?" Arthur felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. There was something in that simple question, in the trust with which the girl looked at him, that touched a part of his soul that had been dormant for years. Ever since he and Eleanor, his wife, discovered they couldn't have children, he had built an emotional barrier around any situation involving kids. I don't know how to help," he answered honestly, but his voice came out softer than he intended. Willow nodded, as if expecting that answer. "That's okay, but you seem kind. My mom always said that kind people have eyes that shine when they look at children." "Your mother?" Arthur crouched down again. "Where is she?" Willow's face closed off instantly. "She went away. Like Poppy. Like everyone." Arthur felt a pang of pain in his chest. He looked at the abandoned van, at the broken toys, at the 4-year-old girl who spoke of abandonment as if she were talking about the weather. Something inside him broke in that moment. "Willow, are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded quickly, her eyes shining with hope. "Come with me. Let's get something to eat and talk." As they walked across the square toward a nearby diner, Arthur couldn't stop thinking about the girl's words. Poppy, a missing sister, an abandoned van full of personal belongings, and a 4-year-old child living alone on the streets, building elaborate stories that might not be as fanciful as everyone thought. Arthur looked at Willow, who walked beside him tightly holding the doll with the short-cut hair, and had the unsettling feeling that his orderly, predictable life was about to be completely turned upside down by this little girl with big eyes and impossible stories. What he didn't know was that Willow held secrets far greater than any adult could imagine, and that this chance encounter in the square was just the first thread in a complex web that connected him to the past in ways he could never have foreseen. 3 weeks had passed since the encounter in the square, and Arthur had developed a routine that his wife Eleanor found strange, to say the least. Every morning, before heading to the Blackwood Springs office, he would stop at St. Benedict's Bakery and buy sweet rolls and warm milk for Willow. The girl would be waiting for him on the same bench in the square, always holding the doll with the cut hair that she had taken from the abandoned van. "Good morning, Mr. Arthur," Willow would greet him, with a smile that lit up her thin face. She had learned his name on his second visit and insisted on calling him formally, as if she were a little adult. That April morning, however, something was different. Willow seemed restless, her large eyes constantly scanning the square as if looking for someone or something specific. "Did something happen?" Arthur asked, sitting beside her on the time-worn wooden bench. "I dreamed about Poppy again," Willow said, biting into her roll slowly. "She was crying, saying her chest hurts a lot, but it wasn't a normal dream, Mr. Arthur. It was different." Arthur had learned not to immediately dismiss Willow's stories. In recent weeks, some of her seemingly fanciful claims had turned out to be surprisingly accurate. She knew, for example, that the white van belonged to a woman named Clara who had worked in the town centre. She also knew that this woman had 2 daughters and had disappeared suddenly. "How do you know the van was your mother's, Willow?" he asked, a question that had been tormenting him for days. "Because I remember her smell," the girl replied naturally. "It smelled like the sweetgrass soap she used to wash. Our clothes, and there was a little hole in the back seat that she made with her fingernail when she got nervous." Arthur felt a chill. These details were too specific to be invented by a 4-year-old. There was something very real in Willow's story, something that everyone in the square preferred to ignore because it was easier to label her as a fanciful girl. At that moment, his cell phone rang. It was Eleanor. "Arthur, you need to come home now," his wife said, and there was an unusual tension in her voice. "A social worker showed up here, looking for you. She said it's about a child you've been meeting." Arthur's stomach turned to ice. He looked at Willow, who continued eating her roll as if nothing had happened, but her ears were clearly tuned to the conversation. "I'm on my way home," he said, ending the call. "Willow, I have to leave early today." "That's okay, Mr. Arthur," she said, but her eyes showed a momentary sadness he had learned to recognize. "Will you be back tomorrow?" "Of course I'll be back," he replied, gently touching the girl's head. "I always come back." When Arthur arrived home, a serious-looking woman was waiting for him in the living room. Ms. Evelyn Reed, 38, had the efficient and weary air of someone who dealt with difficult cases daily. Eleanor was sitting beside her, her hands clasped in her lap, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Mr. Blackwood," Ms. Reed said, standing to greet him, "I'm a social worker for the county. I need to talk to you about a girl named Willow." "What about her?" Arthur asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Have you been meeting with her regularly?" Ms. Reed questioned, consulting a file she carried. "Yes, she lives in the square. I try to help her with food," Arthur answered honestly. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. In the previous 3 weeks, her husband had only casually mentioned that he sometimes helped a child in need. She didn't know the extent or frequency of these meetings. "Mr. Blackwood, this child has been under our supervision for 2 months. We've been trying to find a suitable temporary family for her, but—" Ms. Reed paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "Willow has a history of disturbing behaviors. She invents elaborate stories, talks about non-existent people, has episodes of talking to herself." "And what if the stories aren't invented?" Arthur asked, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Ms. Reed looked at him with renewed interest. "What do you mean by that?" Arthur walked to his living room window, from which he could see part of the central square on the horizon. "Willow told me very specific things about her family, details a child wouldn't invent." "Like what kind of details?" insisted the social worker. "She knows things about a van that was abandoned in the square. She recognizes personal items that were inside it. She talks about a twin sister with very precise details," Arthur explained. "Has anyone investigated whether this sister really exists?" Ms. Reed and Eleanor exchanged significant glances. The social worker consulted her file again. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, that's an interesting point I wanted to discuss. When we first found Willow, she had some torn documents with her. We managed to partially reconstruct a birth certificate that suggests she did indeed have a twin sister." The silence that followed was heavy. Eleanor looked at her husband with an expression that mixed concern and curiosity. "And where is this sister?" Arthur asked. "That's the issue, Mr. Blackwood. We haven't been able to locate her. It's possible they were separated before Willow came to us, but it's also possible that—" Ms. Reed hesitated again. "That what?" "That something happened to her, and the trauma has affected Willow's perception of reality. Very young children sometimes create elaborate narratives to cope with traumatic loss." Arthur sat down heavily in the armchair. His mind worked quickly, connecting dots he had collected over the past few weeks. Willow always spoke of Poppy in the present tense, as if she was still alive somewhere. But there were also moments when the girl showed a sadness too deep for someone who simply missed another person. "And what about her mother? Willow mentioned a woman named Clara Miller," he said. Ms. Reed flipped through a few more pages in her file. "That's another mystery. We found records of a Clara Miller who worked at various places in town between 2018 and 2021. But she simply disappeared from official records 2 years ago. We don't know if she moved, if something happened to her, or if... If what? Insisted Eleanor, speaking for the first time since the conversation began. If the name was actually false, many people in vulnerable situations use different identities to get work, Ms. Reed explained. Arthur stood up abruptly. Clara Miller worked at Blackwood Springs, he said, the words leaving his mouth before he could fully process what he was saying. Both women in the room looked at him in shock. He himself was surprised by the revelation he had just made, but now that he had said it, the pieces began to fit together in a way that made him sick. "How do you know that?" asked Ms. Reed, her posture becoming even more serious. Arthur ran his hands over his face. Clara Miller worked in the gift shop at the Springs between 2019 and 2021. She was fired on suspicion of theft. I signed her dismissal. The silence that followed was unsettling. Eleanor looked at her husband as if she didn't know him. Ms. Reed was taking rapid notes in her pad. "Mr. Blackwood," the social worker said slowly, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about this employee. Every detail could be important for understanding Willow's situation and finding her sister." Arthur sat down again, his mind going back 3 years. He vaguely remembered. Clara, a quiet woman, always punctual, who worked the morning shift organizing products in the gift shop. He also remembered the day his partner, Henry, had appeared in his office with evidence that she was stealing merchandise to resell. "She always seemed like an honest person," he said slowly. But Henry brought evidence, photos of her leaving with products she hadn't bought. "And did you investigate this evidence personally?" asked Ms. Reed. Arthur closed his eyes, remembering those troubled days. At the time, he was facing serious problems in his marriage with Eleanor, issues related to their inability to have children that were consuming them emotionally. He had delegated more responsibilities to Henry and trusted his judgment without question. "No," he admitted, the guilt heavy in his voice. "I trusted my partner. I signed the dismissal without investigating properly." Eleanor reached out and touched her husband's arm. It was the first time in years he had shown such genuine remorse for a professional decision. Ms. Reed closed her file. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to come with me tomorrow to speak with Willow officially, and I also need to speak with your partner about the details of Clara Miller's dismissal. I have a feeling we are dealing with something much more complex than an abandoned child with behavioral problems." When the social worker left, Arthur and Eleanor remained in silence in the living room. The weight of the revelations hung over them like a dark cloud. "Why did you never tell me about your meetings with this girl?" Eleanor finally asked. Arthur looked at his wife, seeing in her the same kind woman he had married 15 years ago, but also noticing the marks that the frustration over not having children had left on them both. "Because I was afraid you'd think I was trying to compensate for something," he answered honestly. Eleanor nodded slowly. "And are you?" Arthur didn't know how to answer. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, he felt he had a purpose that went beyond running his company, and that a 4-year-old girl with impossible stories and eyes too big for her face had brought to the surface guilt and responsibilities he had buried for a long time. Henry Vance's office was on the top floor of the Blackwood Springs complex, with a panoramic view of the mountains surrounding Oak Haven. Arthur climbed the stairs slowly that Friday morning, each step heavier than the last. In his hands, he carried a file with documents Ms. Reed had given him about Willow, and a growing sense that he was about to discover truths he would rather not know. Henry was on the phone when Arthur walked in, gesturing animatedly as he discussed sales figures with someone from the city's tourism department. At 48, He maintained the youthful appearance that had always characterized him. But Arthur noticed for the first time small signs of tension around his eyes. "I need to talk to you." "About Clara Miller," Arthur said as soon as his partner finished the call. Henry's face momentarily lost its color. "Clara? Why are you thinking about her after all this time?" "Because I found out her daughter has been living in the central square for 2 months," Arthur replied, watching his partner's reaction closely. Henry got up from his chair and walked to the window, his back rigid. "Arthur, that was 3 years ago. The woman was a thief. You saw the evidence yourself." "Actually, I didn't. I trusted your report," Arthur said, his voice carrying a tone of accusation he rarely used with his partner. "I want to see the original evidence now." "Why? What difference does it make after all this time?" Arthur approached Henry's desk. "It makes a difference because her daughter is traumatized, talking about a twin sister who disappeared, and I need to know if we committed an injustice." Henry turned to him, and for the first time in 20 years of partnership, Arthur saw genuine fear in his friend's eyes. "Arthur, let this go. The girl will be placed with a suitable family. You don't need to get involved in this." "But I'm already involved," Arthur replied firmly. "And the more I find out about this story, the more I'm sure something doesn't add up." Henry sighed deeply and returned to his chair. He opened a locked drawer in his desk and took out a folder yellowed with age. "Fine, but you're not going to like what you find." Arthur took the folder and opened it. Inside were photographs of Clara leaving the back of the gift shop carrying bags, some altered receipts, and a detailed report written by Henry himself. But as he examined the documents, something began to bother him. These photos were always taken at the same time, he observed, always at 6:30 in the evening, when her shift had already ended. So she was entitled to buy products with an employee discount, Arthur said, remembering a company policy he had forgotten. Why would that be considered theft? Henry was silent for a long moment. Arthur continued to examine the documents and found something that made him freeze. The altered receipts showed legitimate purchases, but with values that had been changed later to look smaller than they really were. "Henry," Arthur said slowly, "these receipts were doctored after the purchase." "Arthur, listen," Henry began, but was interrupted by Arthur's cell phone ringing. It was Ms. Reed. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to come to the courthouse immediately. We've found Willow's sister." Arthur's heart raced. "How? Where?" "She's in Northwood, with a family that informally adopted her 2 years ago. But Mr. Blackwood..." Ms. Reed's voice grew more grave. "The situation is complex. The girl is very sick." Arthur looked at Henry, who had turned even paler. "Sick how?" "Severe heart problems. She needs urgent surgery, but the family caring for her can't afford the treatment. They didn't even know she had a twin sister." Arthur sat down heavily in the chair opposite Henry's desk. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form, creating a picture that nauseated him. "Evelyn, how did you find out where she was?" "Actually, it was Willow who told us. She knew where her sister was all along. Apparently there's a communication network among street children that's much more efficient than any official system." After ending the call, Arthur stared at Henry for a long moment. "Did you know Clara had 2 daughters?" Henry didn't answer immediately. He stood up again and walked to a cabinet, from which he took a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured a generous dose for himself and drank it in one go. "Henry, answer my question." "Yes," he finally said, his voice a whisper. "I knew. And why did you never tell me?" Henry poured himself another drink. Because the situation was complicated, Arthur. Clara was going through serious financial difficulties. One of her daughters was sick and needed expensive treatment. And she came to me asking for a loan, An advance on a few months' salary, Henry continued, avoiding his partner's gaze. I told her. It wasn't possible under our company policies. Arthur felt his stomach churn. So she started taking products to sell? No, Henry turned abruptly. That's not what happened. She always paid for the products. The problem was something else. What other thing? Henry returned to his chair and put his head in his hands. Arthur, do you remember 2020? The financial problems we had with the pandemic? Of course. You delegated all the financial management to me because you were dealing with your personal problems with Eleanor, Henry said, his voice getting lower and lower. And I made some mistakes. Arthur leaned forward. What kind of mistakes? Management mistakes. I made some risky investments with company money. I lost a lot of money in the stock market, trying to quickly recover what we had lost with the temporary closure of the springs. How much money? A lot. Enough to seriously compromise our cash flow, Henry admitted. I was desperate to hide it from you until I could recover the losses. Arthur stood up, beginning to understand where the story was going. And Clara found out about this somehow. She worked in the shop, but she also helped with organizing documents when needed. She saw the inconsistencies in the financial records. She knew something was wrong, Henry said, and then she confronted me. And you fired her to silence her. It wasn't like that, Henry protested. I tried to explain the situation to her. I told her I was working to fix everything, but she said she was going to talk to you directly. Arthur walked to the window, looking at the mountain view that always calmed him, but which now seemed oppressive. So you forged evidence against her? Henry's silence was answer enough. How long did you manage to hide the losses? Arthur asked, still looking out the window. Almost 2 years. I managed to recover some of the money with other, more conservative investments, but the damage was already done. Arthur turned to face his partner. Henry, because of your cowardice, an innocent woman lost her job, was forced to work in precarious conditions to support 2 sick daughters, and apparently something terrible happened to her, leaving 2 4-year-old children completely alone in the world. Henry began to cry. Arthur, I tried to find them afterward. When I heard that that something had happened to her, but the girls had already been sent to different places and I couldn't locate them. You knew one of them was sick? Yes. Poppy had heart problems since she was a baby. That's why Clara was so desperate for money. She needed an expensive surgery, Henry said between sobs. And now you're telling me she's still alive and still needs the same surgery. Arthur grabbed his coat. Henry, you're going to help me fix this. We're going to pay for Poppy's treatment and do whatever is necessary to reunite these girls. Arthur, the costs, I don't care about. The costs, Arthur said firmly. If I have to, I'll sell my share of the company. These children are our responsibility now. As Arthur left the office, leaving Henry alone with his guilt and remorse, his cell phone rang again. It was Eleanor. Arthur, something strange happened here at home. A woman showed up looking for you. She said her name is Susan and that she has information about Willow's family. But Arthur... Eleanor's voice was tense. She's very agitated, saying disconnected things about having cared for one of the girls and about secrets you need to know. Arthur stopped, in the middle of the staircase. Susan, does that name mean anything to you? No, but she insists she knows the truth about what happened to Clara Miller. And Arthur, she's very afraid of something. Arthur ran down the rest of the stairs, knowing he was about to uncover even more disturbing aspects of a story that had already turned his life completely upside down. And in the bottom of his heart, a voice whispered that the secrets he was about to discover would not only change his perception of the past, but would completely define his future. Susan Fisher sat in Arthur's living room with trembling hands, holding a cup of coffee that Eleanor had prepared. The 42-year-old woman appeared physically and emotionally exhausted, her red eyes alternating between tears of regret and genuine terror. "Mrs. Fisher," Arthur said gently, sitting across from her, "my wife told me you have information about Clara Miller and her daughters." Susan nodded nervously. "Mr. Blackwood, I didn't know you were looking for the girls. If I had known sooner—" She paused, wiping her nose with a tissue. "Clara was my younger sister." The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor and Arthur exchanged significant glances. All the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to connect. "Your sister?" Arthur asked. "Yes. Clara Miller was Clara Fisher when we were kids. She changed her last name when she left home at 17, after a bad fight with me and our parents," Susan explained, her voice heavy with remorse. "We lost contact for almost 10 years. Eleanor sat beside her husband. "And how did you reconnect?" "She sought me out in 2021, a few months after being fired from the Springs. She was desperate, penniless, with 2 young daughters to raise alone," Susan said, the tears starting to flow freely. "One of them, Poppy, was very sick. She needed heart surgery that cost a fortune." "And you helped her?" Arthur asked. Susan shook her head negatively, the shame evident on her face. "I didn't help. Not in the way I should have. I was angry at her for disappearing from the family for all those years. When she showed up at my door asking for help, I said terrible things." "What kind of things?" Eleanor insisted. "I said she had made her choices, and now she had to deal with the consequences. I said, it wasn't my responsibility to take care of her daughters," Susan sobbed. "But then I offered a solution that seemed good at the time." Arthur leaned forward. "What solution?" "I knew a family in Northwood who was looking for a child to raise. Good people, honest workers, but they couldn't have their own children. I offered to broker an informal adoption for Poppy, since she was the one who needed urgent medical care the most." "And Clara agreed?" "Not immediately. She cried, begged me to help in another way, but I insisted it would be the best for the girls, that a family could take better care of Poppy than she ever could alone," Susan said, her voice breaking. "I convinced her it was temporary, just until she could get back on her feet financially." Eleanor took her husband's hand, feeling the tension radiating from him. "And Willow?" "Willow would stay with me temporarily while Clara looked for work. That was the agreement," Susan explained. "But after Poppy went to Northwood, Clara started working in a sewing factory in terrible conditions, doing double shifts to save money so she could get both her daughters back." "And what happened to her?" Arthur asked, though he sensed he wouldn't want to hear the answer. Susan closed her eyes. 7 months after starting at the factory, she had an accident with one of the machines. The equipment was poorly maintained. The safety conditions were awful. She didn't survive. The silence in the room was deafening. Arthur stood up and walked to the window, processing the information that his decision to fire Clara had indirectly led to her death. "And the girls?" Eleanor asked in a trembling voice. "When Clara passed away, I should have gone to get Willow and taken care of both girls. After all, they were my nieces," Susan said, the guilt weighing on every word. "But I was going through serious personal problems. I had lost my job. I was drinking a lot. My marriage had ended." "So you abandoned Willow?" Arthur asked, turning to face her. "Not exactly. I tried to take care of her for a few weeks, but I was completely unprepared. Willow cried all the time, asking for her mother and her sister. I didn't know how to explain to a 3-year-old that her mother was dead," Susan explained. "And the more she asked, the more I drank to deal with the guilt." Eleanor covered her mouth with her hands, imagining the suffering little Willow had been through. "So I decided to take her to a public orphanage. I thought it would be better for her than staying with an aunt who couldn't even take care of herself," Susan continued. "But on the way there, she managed to run away. She was tiny but very smart. She hid on the floor in the back of my van and only got out when we were in the city center." "And you didn't go after her?" Arthur asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "I searched for hours, but it was as if she had vanished. I thought someone had found her and taken care of her, or that she had managed to reach a distant relative," Susan said, wiping her tears. "I was so lost at the time that I convinced myself it was for the best." "And why are you here now?" Eleanor asked. Susan took a deep breath before answering. "Because I found out yesterday that you were looking for information about Clara and the girls. A friend who works at the courthouse told me about the investigation that was happening, and because—" She hesitated. "Because what?" Arthur insisted. "Because 2 weeks ago, the family that was caring for Poppy contacted me. They found out how to reach me and told me she was very sick, that she needed an urgent surgery they couldn't afford," Susan said. "And they told me she was always asking about a twin sister named Willow." Arthur sat down again. "The family in Northwood didn't know Poppy had a sister?" "I never told them. I thought it would be easier if they didn't know, that Poppy would forget." "Over time," Susan admitted, the shame evident. "But she never forgot. She always talked about an identical sister she had left behind." At that moment, Arthur's phone rang. It was Ms. Reed. "Mr. Blackwood, there's news about Poppy. We've received authorization to transfer her to Western University Hospital, where there are specialists in pediatric cardiac surgery. But we need a quick decision on the funding." "The funding is guaranteed," Arthur said without hesitation. "Do whatever is necessary." "Mr. Blackwood, it's about $200,000 just for the surgery, not counting hospitalization and recovery." "I said it's guaranteed." "And Willow? Can she be part of the process?" "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, Willow had a very interesting reaction when she learned we had found Poppy. She said something that intrigued us," said Ms. Reed. "She said she always knew where her sister was, but she was waiting to find someone who could really help them both. Someone who had a good heart and deep pockets," in her words. Arthur looked at Susan, who had turned pale. "Evelyn, bring Willow here. She needs to meet her aunt and understand the whole truth about her family." After ending the call, Arthur faced Susan. "Mrs. Fisher, you are going to help me correct all these mistakes. We will reunite these girls, take care of Poppy's treatment, and ensure they have a real family." "But Mr. Blackwood, I'm in no condition to care for them. I'm still trying to rebuild my own life," Susan protested. "Then they will stay with us," Eleanor said suddenly, surprising her husband. "Temporarily, until you stabilize and prove yourself capable of being the aunt they deserve." Arthur looked at his wife with admiration. It was the first time in years he had seen such genuine determination and purpose in her eyes. "Eleanor, are you sure?" "I am. These girls have lost everything because of mistakes adults made. It's our moral responsibility to care for them now," Eleanor said firmly. "And Arthur, maybe this is exactly what our marriage needed, a purpose greater than our own problems." 2 hours later, Willow arrived at Arthur's house, accompanied by Ms. Reed. When she saw Susan in the living room, the girl's reaction was complex, a mixture of recognition, hurt, and a disturbing maturity for her 4 years. "Hi, Aunt Susan," Willow said simply, as if they had seen each other the day before. Susan began to cry uncontrollably. "Willow, my dear, forgive me. Auntie did everything wrong, but now I'm going to try to fix it." Willow approached her aunt and, to everyone's surprise, hugged her. "Auntie was lost, like me and Poppy, but now Mr. Arthur and Miss Eleanor are going to help us find each other again." Arthur knelt beside Willow. "You always knew I could help you, didn't you?" Willow nodded with a smile that carried a wisdom impossible for her age. "My mom always said that good people have sad eyes when they see children suffering, and your eyes got very sad when you saw me in the square." That night, for the first time in 8 months, Willow slept in a real bed, in a room with toys and books, knowing that the next day she would see her twin sister. And Arthur and Eleanor discovered that sometimes the greatest blessings in life come disguised as the greatest challenges, and that a little lie told by a 4-year-old girl in the central square had actually been a cry for help that would forever change the destiny of a broken but not lost family. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Let me know what you thought of my story by giving it a score from 0 to 10, and thank you so much.